Fred Fleitz was a national security official during Donald Trump's first administration. Before that, he spent 19 years with the CIA as an analyst. He's now vice chair of the America First Policy Institute's Center for American Security. It's a think tank founded in 2021 to promote Trump's public policy agenda. He joins me now. Thank you for joining me, Fred Fleitz. Let me get straight in with this. On Monday, President Putin said he was open to talks with Trump on Ukraine. What does the US need to do now to get these talks underway?
Well, I think this is really good news. As you probably know, Joe Biden, the last time he spoke with Putin was in February 2022. And even in the depths of the Cold War, the United States president would speak to the head of the Soviet Union. So I think the fact that Trump wants to talk, not necessarily make a deal with Putin, is good news. So I think there will be an immediate outreach by Trump officials, now new Secretary of State Rubio. Eventually, I believe my AFPI colleague, General Keith Kellogg, who will be Trump's new Russia-Ukraine special envoy, he will be meeting with his counterparts in Russia and in Ukraine. And I think we're going to see rapid progress towards getting negotiations to end the war in Ukraine.
I suppose before negotiations can start, there needs to be a ceasefire. And I also suppose, but correct me if I'm wrong, that a ceasefire would mean freezing the current battle lines. If that happens, inevitably, doesn't that mean Russia gets to hold on to everything in Ukraine that it already occupies?
Well, the negotiations will be held to get the ceasefire, and then there will be talks afterward to find a final solution. Now, General Kellogg and I published a paper last spring that suggested a ceasefire for this conflict and freezing it along the current battle lines. Ukraine would not give up any territorial claims, but they would be negotiated later. And I know that's, in a perfect world, that's unsatisfactory, but realistically, Ukraine is losing this war. It's running out of troops. And I agree with Donald Trump. It's time to stop the killing.
What sort of pressure can President Trump bring to bear on President Putin to get a decent settlement?
The best way that Trump can influence Putin is by being strong. We know that dictators respect strength. I think a strong and decisive president who is also considered unpredictable gives Trump an advantage. But Trump's going to have to assure Putin that he's going to get a deal that's fair. And again, in a perfect world, it's not a deal I would give the Russians, but we don't live in that world. I think among the things that will be offered is taking NATO membership for Ukraine off the table for a certain number of years, and perhaps offering some type of incentive, such as lowering sanctions, depending on how cooperative Russia is with the agreement.
I mean, Mr. Trump has some bargaining cards there. We know the Russian economy is on its back. We know that Russia's even running out of money in its sovereign fund. I think interest rates are 21%. Inflation is high. There's people having to tighten their belts. There are some pressures that America could bring to bear that could help Mr. Putin be more forthcoming than he might otherwise be.
That's exactly right. And look, if the U.S. and its allies could come up with a path to end Russia's isolation and bring it into the community of Western European nations, that would be a good thing. Now, maybe this won't happen until Putin leaves the political scene, but the current plan, the current tendency of simply isolating Russia more and more is pushing it into the arms of China. That's not good for global security. It's not good for European security. And there has to be a broader plan to reverse that.
Let me ask you a broader question before I move on to the Middle East about Europe. Ukraine is one of these issues that dragged America back into the European theatre, even as it saw the 21st century as the Pacific century, that's where the action should be for America. If Ukraine is resolved in some way, even if it freezes things as they are, even if it's unsatisfactory, but some sort of deal is done, does the Trump administration then have much interest in Europe after that?
Oh, I think so, because we have such a close relationship with Europe. But you're right about how Ukraine has changed the focus of American foreign policy. But if the war in Ukraine could be changed, it could have vast international implications. Russia will stop buying weapons from Iran, hopefully. Hopefully, this will break this new relationship between Russia and North Korea. It could lead to a change in our relationship with China, because perhaps we can break this new Russia-China axis and we'll be negotiating with China on a different basis. So Ukraine could be at the center for changing and stabilizing global politics.
Interesting. You mentioned Iran there. Let's move on to the Middle East. So we have a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. We don't know how long it's going to stay, or whether it breaks down quickly, how many more hostages will get out. But what do you think the Trump administration wants to happen next? Assume the ceasefire holds. It's not a political settlement. It's not a negotiation. It's not a peace deal. What would the Trump administration like to see happen next?
Well, I'm not speaking for President Trump. I don't work for him. But first of all, there's going to be a rock solid relationship between the U.S. and Israel. We're not going to see bickering between the U.S. and Israel like we saw during the Trump administration. Peace plans being floated by the U.S. and the press that Israeli officials did not know about. That's going to end. And I think this strong relationship and the perception of success in Gaza is going to drive other successes. It's going to lead to possibilities for expanding the Abraham Accords, improving America's relationship with Saudi Arabia, and significantly increasing the pressure on Iran. And all sanctions and oil sanctions against Iran are going to be enforced until Iran agrees to negotiations and stops its hostile policies. Concerning Hamas, the Trump administration will not be willing to accept Hamas controlling Gaza. It might be controlling it now, but I think this is temporary. But in the short term, I believe the Trump administration is with Netanyahu to get the hostages out. This may be an imperfect three-part deal. We're in the first version, the first stage now. 33 hostages, maybe 23 hostages, living hostages, are scheduled to be released. I think the Trump administration will see that through as long as Hamas will cooperate.
Of course, if it's a deal breaker that Hamas stays in charge of Gaza, and I understand why people wouldn't want that, it does make it then more difficult to move on from ceasefire to any kind of two-state solution or anything that creates a certain element of sovereignty in some land for the Palestinians. Does that matter to the Trump administration, or is it a Trump administration, which, of course, the first one gave us the Abraham Accords, its priority is to get the Saudis to join these accords? But maybe the Saudis won't unless they see some progress towards something for the Palestinians.
The Palestinians should not have a veto on expanding the Abraham Accords, just like they didn't in the first Trump administration. I don't think the Saudis are going to insist on that. I can't speak for them, but I don't think that will happen. The two-state solution is dead. It's off the table. It's not going to happen for the foreseeable future until the Palestinian people are de-radicalized. When we have a people who are being trained by the time they're toddlers to kill Jews, to destroy the state of Israel, this is a people that can't be trusted with their own state. When their mosques and education system and media are de-radicalized, and this could be done, it'll be a massive effort, then I believe the Israeli government will talk about a two-state solution. But I think educated people should simply stop talking about that, because the Israeli government, the Israeli people, will never allow it after October 7th.
And I understand that, but it does follow that if a two-state solution is off the agenda, and it hasn't, frankly, been very high on the agenda for quite some time now, that means there is I don't see what the fallback, there's no political solution to fall back on now. It's a kind of rigor mortis of the status quo.
I think it is an open question on who or what will govern Gaza after this three-stage ceasefire agreement is finished. I don't have an answer for that. The Biden administration put forward a notional plan. I think Tony Blinken put it forward in his speech in the administration's final week in office. Perhaps we're going to have Arab states will come in. Maybe there will be peacekeepers in Gaza. I don't know what the solution to that is. That's going to take some very inventive diplomacy by the United States and its allies to solve.
Let me stick with the Middle East for a moment. Hamas is clearly been fraction of its former self. Hezbollah has been decapitated and more. The Assad regime has fallen in Syria, and that was the main way Iran could funnel stuff to its proxies, both money and arms. What to do now about Iran, which is very much, I would suggest, on the back foot? Should the Trump administration work with Israel to destabilize the regime in Iran in the hope of some change, or should it even help Israel with the bunker busters to take out the nuclear facilities?
I would add to that list that Iran pulled its troops out of Syria, which was a big deal. I mean, Iran is significantly weakened, and it's been exposed as considerably weaker militarily than was generally known. Now, some of my conservative fellow travelers think this is the time the U.S. should bomb Iran. I don't think that is going to be President Trump's approach. He has always tried to use tools of statecraft short of war before resorting to military force. And I think Trump will again express willingness for negotiations with Iranian officials. I hope they'll take that up. They didn't in the first administration, but I think we're going to see sanctions. We're going to see legal action, efforts to isolate Iran diplomatically before President Trump decides to go for any type of military strike on Iran.
You mentioned sanctions before. The Biden administration loosened the sanctions and indeed resulted in quite a lot of money becoming available to the regime in Tehran. It follows that Mr. Trump will tighten these sanctions again at a time which could have an impact in Tehran because the economy is on its knees already.
Well, the Biden administration was a bad copy of the Obama administration. It tried to appease Iran. It tried to revise this extremely bad nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and Iran is an estimated $100 billion richer today than it would have been if Trump had had a second term, had not lost the 2020 election, because the Biden administration refused to enforce U.S. sanctions, especially oil sanctions. And where did that oil go? It was sold to China. That's going to change under the Trump administration. Nations that violate American sanctions, they will be subjected to secondary sanctions by the U.S.
Let me just finish up. It's been fascinating talking to you. Just one more question on a less important matter. You worked with John Bolton, and it didn't work out. You're not the first person that it hasn't worked out with John Bolton. What do you think about Mr. Trump revoking his security detail since he's had death threats from Iran?
You know, I haven't really looked into that issue. I worked for Bolton for a while, but I had to denounce Bolton because of the book he came out with in early 2020 that revealed candid conversations he had with the president when he was national security advisor. Now, Bolton also, there was an action taken to lift his security clearance by President Trump yesterday. I don't know whether he has a clearance or not, but I think it should be clear that if you're a close advisor to the president, you have to keep the discussions you have with the president private, so he knows he can trust his advisors. And Bolton violated that rule. I think that was a serious mistake, and I hope a message has been sent to Trump's advisors that that's unacceptable behavior.
It's amazing what people would do to sell books. Fred Fleitz, thanks for joining us. Come back and talk to us again. It's been fascinating to listen to you. That's Fred Fleitz. He's Vice Chair of America's First Policy Institute Center for American Security.